have a tendency to do that, to leave these often very sensitive, hurt parts of us back frozen in time during these traumas. And how that's a lot of the work I've been doing, is to try and help people retrieve those parts and help them transform. So just to give a little background, I have developed this internal family systems model over the last 40 years, now almost 40 years. And back in the day, I was trained as a family therapist. So I was one of those obnoxiously zealous family therapists who thought we'd found the Holy Grail, and the people who spent time rummaging around in intrapsychic world were wasting their time, because we could change all that by just changing the way families related to each other, and set out to prove that, and found that the prophecy failed, because I did an outcome study and the clients didn't realize they'd been cured by us doing family therapy. And it was with bulimia, so a bunch of my clients kept binging and purging. So out of frustration, I began asking why, and they started talking about these different parts of them. That's the word they used. And they would talk, for example, about a part that when something bad happened or they got triggered, this critic would attack them inside. And then that would bring up a part that could make them feel totally young and empty and alone and worthless. And that feeling was so distressing that almost to the rescue would come a binging part, and would turn them into an unfeeling eating machine, getting them out of their body, really. But the act of the binge would bring back the critic, who's calling them a pig on top of the other names. And then that would bring back that young, empty, hurt part. So the binge had to come back, and they'd be trapped in that vicious cycle. And as I heard all that, it reminded me of a family, because they were being described as these semi-autonomous inner entities almost, that had a life of their own. And at first I thought my clients were probably sicker than I thought. Maybe they had multiple personality disorder. But as I listened more carefully and also listened inside myself, I could tell that I had them too. And some of them were pretty extreme about food and me. And then I got curious, and over time, and as a family therapist, I was having my clients interact with them as I might with working with a family. So I might have my young teenage bulimic kid talking to her critic, and I was trying to get her to stand up to it and not believe the critical things it said, and finding that it was just getting more and more extreme that way. And at some point, I tried something different and just tried to have her listen to it. And as she did that, you began to realize that it wasn't what it seemed. And I'll get into that in a minute. But the point of that is that many, many years later now, it turns out that we all have these parts, that it's the natural state of the mind to have parts, that there aren't any bad ones. They're all valuable. They all bring wonderful qualities and resources to us, but that they are distorted out of their naturally valuable states by trauma. And many of them become frozen in the trauma time. And they pick up extreme beliefs and emotions that came into us from those traumas, what I'm going to call burdens. And those burdens then almost act like a virus, if you'll excuse the expression. They drive the way the part operates thereafter. And again, I just discovered that from experimenting with my clients back in the day and hearing from these parts about their secret histories of how they were forced into these roles, but and that they were protecting other parts, and they were polarized with others. And as I heard all of that, it did sound like it was a kind of internal family. And it was like they were these inner children. Like family therapy's big contribution was to say you can't take a child out of their family, child that's acting out, and tell them to just cut it out. You've got to understand the dynamics that are leading the child to be in extreme state. And as I was listening, it seemed like the same was true with these parts. They weren't the roles they were forced into. They were, like that child, forced into these roles that could be quite extreme and damaging, and sometimes were necessary during the trauma, but now we're anachronistic. Now that you're grown up, you don't need them to still be so critical or terrified or protect you in these ways they had to back then. So that's my belief, that we all have them, that those of us who have suffered trauma have some that are still living back there that we left in the dust and can cause symptoms. And so that's one major set of assumptions that has served me very well. The radical aspect of that is there aren't any bad ones. That I'm sort of the Will Rogers of the phenomena. I've never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. And we've done this work with all kinds of parts that seem so pathological and sometimes even heinous in the way they act. And even with those parts, if approached from a mindful place, from a place of curiosity, they'll reveal how they're stuck back there too. So it's in that sense a very uplifting kind of optimistic view, because not only aren't there any bad ones, but once they are witnessed and actually loved by you, they can transform, they can unburden, they can release these extreme beliefs and emotions that they've been carrying sometimes for 40 years. And once they release those, they do transform. So this is a model of transformation with trauma. It's not a model of become mindfully separate from these things and be accepting of them, but don't expect them to change. This actually helps these parts of us change into their naturally valuable states, almost like a curse has been lifted. So that's one set of assumptions about it. But the second, and that's hard enough to believe, the second set is even harder. And I stumbled onto that discovery, again, because I brought this family systems kind of approach where, as people were talking about their parts, I got hip to the fact that they weren't what they seemed, and they actually deserved to be listened to rather than fought against or ignored, which is the way most people were trying to relate to them. I started to try and have my clients get to know the critic, or get to know the one that made them binge, or get to know the addicted part, or whatever part it was. And so I would have them have these inner dialogues. And with the hope that my client would begin to listen. And I would find that might start out that way, but in the middle, my client was getting really angry. Let's say they were talking to the critic and suddenly get angry at the critic. And it reminded me of family sessions where I would have two people trying to talk to each other and get along better, but a third person would jump into the conversation. And we were taught as family therapists to get that person to step out. And you would find that the person who came in on one person's side and was influencing that person to get more extreme, now that they're out of the person's line of vision, they calm down and they have a better conversation. So I thought maybe the same thing's happening in this inner system. Maybe as my client's talking to this critic, a part who hates the critic has jumped in. So I would ask clients, could you find that one and could you get it to step back in there? And to my amazement, clients would say, okay, it did. And I'd say, then how do you feel now toward this critic? And they'd say something entirely different, often in the direction of, I'm just kind of curious about why it calls me names. Or I feel sorry for it, that it has to do this. And when I had them in that state, the conversation with the critic would go very well, because the critic would talk about why it was doing what it was doing and what it was afraid would happen if it didn't do that. And there was always something it was protecting. And we could then extend some appreciation and compassion to it, and it would melt even more. And then we would negotiate if we could go to the part that the critic protects and heal it so it wasn't as vulnerable, would this part have to be so extreme? And they would always say, no, but I don't really think you can do that. So we would negotiate permission and go to the part it protects. And there's a whole process for healing that I'll talk about in a minute. And come back, and now the critic doesn't want to be a critic. It wants to do something entirely different. Sometimes even the opposite of what it had been doing. It wants to be your cheerleader now. And over time, I would see that if the client would follow up and do this on their own, and most people can do a version of this on their own, the changes would stick. So what I got curious about, because I found with other clients, as I would try to have these dialogues, and they would get extreme, and I would ask whatever part, okay, if now you're scared, let's get that scared one to step back, or let's get that dissociating part to step back, or whatever it was. At some point, they would enter that same state where they were curious or calm or confident or even compassionate toward the part they were working with. And when I would ask about what part of you is that, they'd say some version of, that's not a part like these others, that's me, that's myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And now, 40 years later, thousands of clients later, thousands of therapists doing this all over the world, we can safely say that that self is in everybody and can't be damaged and knows how to heal and contains these, what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. I mentioned 3 of them already: curiosity, calm, confidence, and compassion, but also courage, clarity, creativity, and connectedness. And so it was almost like the same person would pop out in different clients just by getting these other protective, usually parts of them, to open space inside. And so not only can it not be damaged and knows how to heal, but it turns out it's just beneath the surface of all these parts, such that when they do relax and open space, you become that self, and you know how to heal yourself from that place. So that was a mind-boggling discovery for me, because I'd been trained that for you to have that kind of ego strength, you had to have had a certain kind of parenting during a critical period in your childhood. And I searched my clients' histories to find that good parent unsuccessfully, because some of my clients had been tortured on a daily basis. And I ultimately had to conclude that that self doesn't have to come from a relationship. It doesn't have to come into you from some external person, that it's our birthright, that that's in us, that we're born with this awareness of how to heal ourselves both internally and how to heal our relationships. Because when people can speak and relate to each other from self, that also becomes a natural healing process.